Okay, hello and welcome back. So last time we ended, we were talking about the difference between externalized controls and internalized social controls. Now we're going to be talking about what those controls are. And we're going to use this word sanctions as a way to talk about methods of enforcement. So sanctions are the rewards and punishments that all societies use to encourage people to behave according to norms and expectations. And when I say all societies, I do mean all societies, be they foragers, horticulturalists, pastoralists, farmers, intensive agriculturalists, or post industrialists like ourselves. And these sanctions can take the form of positive or negative sanctions. We'll discuss that in a minute. But first, let's talk about formal versus informal sanctions. So, a formal sanction is a method of social control employing rewards and punishments that are explicit and well known, often written down and administered by special agents of control who possess the authority to administer them, such as police and courts. So, up until this point, this is what we've mostly been talking about when we talk about social control and sanctions. The prison guard, the police officer, these are people that follow the law, which is written down. Everybody knows what the rules are. Don't speed in the streets. Don't shoot your neighbor. These sorts of basic laws that we're all familiar with. Now, there's also informal sanctions, and these are rewards or punishments that are widely understood in a society, but not precisely defined, usually not written down, and for which no specialized role exists to administer the sanctions. You could think of examples of these being loud in the library. These are well known, but not really typically written down. Be quiet in the library, and everybody's going to make a certain amount of sound, but exactly how much noise in a library you're allowed to make is certainly not written down. And so there are these informal ways that we tend to police this kind of thing. You could gossip about a person who's loud in the library. There, see these negative down here in the bottom right. These negative informal ways. You could look at the person and make a very rude expression. Maybe if you're at a movie theater and somebody's whispering too loudly, you might look at them and make a gesture, a rude expression, or you might hurl an insult at them, right? These are negative and informal methods of sanctions. But there's also positive and formal methods of sanctions. These are praising somebody, a friendly expression. I'm walking my dog, and I have a very big dog. I think, no, you haven't met him, but if we were doing a video conference, you would meet him. He's a very big bull mastiff, about 100 pounds. And he looks scary, but he's just a big lug. And so sometimes I cross the street when other people are coming at me. I'm walking the dog and there's other people coming at me and they have a dog or maybe they have a small child. I know that my dog is perfectly safe and he's going to be fine, but I'll just cross the street for their benefit because they look worried. They look worried about my large dog. And they might give me a friendly expression. They might wave to me and they might even say, oh, thank you. So these are positive, informal sanctions that help reward me for my widely understood but not exactly defined, not exactly well defined behavior. They're rewarding me for positive behavior. And then we can look at some, we've already discussed these formal terms of sanctions, but remember that we've mostly discussed negative formal sanctions. That's prison guards shooting people, that's getting a fine from going too fast on the road, in your car, going to prison. Eternal torment in hell is something that your book discusses. But there's also positive and formal reward sanctions. So that would be a reward, like in the classroom. I reward you with an A because you're so good in the class. When you're in kindergarten, your teacher might give you a sticker, a gold star. These are these sort of, well, I guess that wouldn't be terribly formal. That might be more informal reward. But you could get a promotion at work or the eternal life in heaven, right? These are all positive and formal sanctions. So I'm going to briefly define power because we've talked about power, but you want to also know what it means. And power, in this sense, the social power, is the ability of a person or group or institution to influence the course of an outcome of a social interaction. Okay? So sanctions are one manifestation of power, and power is not in a person. people don't just have power within them, but power exists between people. So between myself and my students, I have a certain amount of power. I can, I don't know, give you a bad grade if I don't like you. It wouldn't be very nice of me. Or I can yell at you to be quiet. I can kick you out of class. These are all in my power to do. Never done them. But that is something that teachers do to students sometimes. They exert power, and that power exists between teachers and students. However, the moment I get in my car and I decide to drive 300 miles an hour, as if my car could possibly do that, decide to drive really fast and recklessly, the police officer who pulls me over, I can't kick him out of class. I can't. My power has nothing. My internal power, which there is nothing, power is not internal, does not apply in this situation because my role as a professor doesn't have anything to do with the police officer. In that situation, I am a citizen and they are a police officer, and I am in the position of being under less power. So, power always requires the cooperation of those under power with those in power. If I just chose not to act like a citizen, I could pretend to be a police officer or something and not cooperate with the police officer. And then they have to use other forms of power. I'm no longer just being I'm not acting the way a citizen is supposed to if I decide not to pull over for the police officer like I'm supposed to. And so there's other kinds of power that they can use. Here, there's sources of power. Their source of power or their authority might not be working on me, and they might use force. So let's go through these one by one, rather than exploring that example any further. So authority is a source of power, and it's the form or source of power that derives from age, skill, knowledge, or office. My office as a professor is where my source of power comes from, only when I'm in this room. My age, the police officer also comes from his power, source of authority comes from his office as a police officer. An office is just a social position in which specific rights and responsibilities occur. One source of political authority and social control. Just like the president, for good or bad, has authority by way of his office. It's a social position that comes with certain specific rights and responsibilities. Now, there's also coercion. Somebody might not have authority over you, but they could coerce you. That's power based on the threat or use of force. Coercion often happens between individuals, but it can also happen between nations. A nation might say, do what we want, open up your country to trade with us and give us very favorable trade agreement, or we will invade you. That is coercion. There's also persuasion, a source of social and political power based on the ability to move people to agree with you or obey this persuader. Often exercised through linguistic skill, the ability to give a good speech, and the manipulation of resources and social relationships. This is something very well, the source of power that we saw with the actor in the Dr. Fox lectures. So he didn't actually have an office. He wasn't actually a professor. He didn't have any of the things that would give him authority because he didn't have any of those skills or special knowledge. He didn't coerce the audience into believing what he said, but he was able to persuade them very effectively through his linguistic skill and through the manipulation of resources. And the resource that he manipulated was social capital, as we discussed. Now, if all these fail, typically the last source of power that comes into play is the use of force. That is the actual use of physical force, violence, and torture. Now, every level of political integration, which we're going to be talking about as we move forward, uses different kinds of sanctions, uses different kinds of social controls, depending on their political level of political integration. So this is a nice chart that I believe comes from your book, and it breaks down some of these things that we've been talking about ever since we started discussing economics. So the band is a level of integration, which you should all remember is typically pretty egalitarian. They tend to be foragers, hunter-gatherers. Sometimes they are horticulturalists. Then we move up to tribes and chiefdoms. Chiefdoms are obviously going to be the intensive agriculturalists and possibly the state. And then, and everything in between. So let's go through some of these. Now, I don't need you to memorize all of this, right? You don't need to memorize all of this, so you don't have to know every little detail for my exam. But it would be good if I said that there's a group of people with a decentralized form of power, a nomadic settlement pattern, that don't use coercion. Their mode of production is foraging, and they live in very small populations of 20 or 30 people. Which of the kinds of level of integration is that? Do you think that's the band, the tribe, the chiefdom, or the state? Well, I think most of you would be able to pick out the band. So that's the level of knowledge I'm looking for this. So the band, again, is 30 to 50 people. They tend to be foragers. They are decentralized power. There's not typically a king or somebody who has a lot of authority over everybody else in the band. Everything's fairly democratic. They're nomadic settlement-wise. The government is very informal. There's not a lot of roles and responsibilities for the head people. Conflict resolution tends to be very informal, and their social stratification is egalitarian. So just about everybody has the same material wealth. And if you did the reading that we assigned early on in the class, the reading on the Kung Bushmen, they have certain kinds of leveling mechanisms. That's why I've included leveling mechanism there at the bottom, is a practice to establish or reestablish social equity or parity, usually by bringing down individuals or groups that threaten to get above or better than others. So if you did that reading, then you'll remember that the anthropologist picked out a very, very big, heavy bowl and then gave it to everybody as a gift. And people didn't want the anthropologist to feel above them or get above them and have them owe him a favor. So everybody made fun of him, even though he bought the biggest, fattest bowl in all the land that was very, very delicious, and everybody ate it and ate it and ate it. They all made fun of him and said, "Oh, this is the worst bowl we've ever seen. It's so skinny. There's barely even enough meat," and et cetera, et cetera. That's a kind of leveling mechanism. And other groups do this too. And you might even think of some leveling mechanisms that you and your friends do. If somebody asks, "Hey, can I borrow $1 to get coffee?" and they say, "Thank you. Oh my God, thank you for the dollar so I could buy coffee." It's cheap coffee. Doesn't matter. You might say, "Oh, it's nothing. Don't worry about it." You don't want, in a friendship, you're never above the other person, as we discussed in last class. Friendships are equal, and so you might use a leveling mechanism to try to reestablish social equity. Now we have the tribe. In the political integration level of the tribe, the population is in the hundreds. Power is decentralized, but sometimes there is a headman who is just by way of their knowledge of being older and more experienced. They are the headman, but they still might not have a ton of power. Organization tends to be kinship or kin-based clans. They might have a village, maybe one or two villages, as far as their settlement pattern, but they're generally fairly settled, semi-nomadic. Leadership is egalitarian, but again, sometimes a headman. There's not very much coercion. There's not a lot of threats of physical violence within the group in order to maintain order. Conflict resolution remains informal, and the social stratification is egalitarian, or maybe slight distinctions. Maybe some people in the group might have a slightly larger farming area, slightly more land to farm on, or a larger group of animals that they take care of themselves, so they have a little bit more access to meat, blood, and milk. Now, the chiefdom, as we discussed earlier, has populations in the thousands. They are centralized and hereditary. This is when you start getting into the mode of production, such as large horticulturalist or very large pastoral societies, and usually intensive agriculture. So there's centralized hereditary power, might be a king, might be a queen, might be a ruling family. Organization has classes and residence patterns based on class. All the wealthy people live together and all the poor people live together. There's typically multiple settlements that are fixed and not moving around. They're permanent settlements. Government is multi-layered with low levels of bureaucracy, mid-levels of bureaucracy, and high levels of bureaucracy. There might be a king or a queen, and yes, there is coercion. You do have to follow the rules that the king and the queen put out, or you will be coerced. There will be violence or some sort of severe punishment. And conflict resolution typically becomes formal. There's usually a court system or a judge or some sort of formal bureaucracy for taking care of conflicts. Because at this level of thousands of people living together, it's more complicated to maintain order. There's more rules that you have to follow, as I think we're learning during this COVID-19 pandemic. You have to follow the rules more strictly in order to benefit everybody. Oh, it looks like we don't have a slide for the state. I'm sorry, there should have been a slide. But yeah, we will move on. So go ahead and watch this documentary. I'm going to upload it right now. Watch this full documentary. It's only about 20 minutes or so, and there are some political overtones. I don't mean to be trying to sway anybody politically. It's at the very end of the film, so if you don't want to watch that, you can just kind of turn it off once you at the end. But for the most part, it's a little bit of a documentary about North Korea and the kinds of ways that they try to maintain order, right? So they are a state. They are over 50,000 population, over that 50,000. They're 25 million. They have fixed settlements. They have class and residence. They have multiple ethnicities, but most are South North Korean. They have a centralized leadership, many, many, many levels of bureaucracy, monopoly of force and information. They very much meet the definition of the state. So watch this documentary, and I want you to think about in what ways does North Korean society resemble or not resemble the Panopticon? In what ways does our own society resemble or not resemble the Panopticon? And you might think, while you're watching the documentary, of the ways that American society might actually resemble in degree, but not, excuse me, in kind, but not necessarily degree, the kinds of power and social control that North Korea exerts over its own population.